Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by William Inboden entitled The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, published 3 weeks ago by Dutton. Our distinguished discussants this afternoon are Ambassador Paula Dobrensky and Melvin Leffler. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the seminar. My colleague and fellow co-chair, Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center, is at this moment somewhere over the Atlantic and can't be with us today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic and, I guess, post-pandemic era, right here in the virtual realm. Behind the scenes, we thank two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. On the logistics front, please take note, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with those preliminaries out of the way, let's get this seminar underway fully. Our author this afternoon is William Inboden, the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security and Associate Professor of Public Affairs and History at the LBJ School at the University of Texas, Austin. He holds an AB from Stanford and a PhD from Yale, both in history. He's also a National Intelligence Council Associate. He serves on the CIA's Historical Advisory Panel and the State Department's Historical Advisory Panel. He's a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine. He's the author of Religion and American Foreign Policy, 1945 to 1960, The Soul of Containment, published by Cambridge in 2008. And his commentaries have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and other outlets. Today, he will be speaking on his just published book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. William, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thanks, of course, to Christian in absentia, as he's somewhere over the Atlantic. My thanks to the AHA and the Wilson Center. And of course, to Mel and Paula, who I'm very eager to hear your thoughts. As per Eric's guidance, I'll start with about 15 or so minutes of some framing comments on some of the highlights, the main themes I would love for us to be able to chew on with the book, and a little bit about how and why I went about researching and writing it. And let me start with that part first, especially because I know there's a number of graduate students and younger scholars on the call. I think that we are in, and for a number of years, I hope will continue to be a golden era for scholarship on the 1980s, on American foreign policy in the 1980s. Over the last decade, there have been a wave of new documents declassified. And more forthcoming, so many of our friends in the State Department's Office of the Historian producing more and more Fruce volumes on the Reagan administration. A number of great ones have come out, a number of others are coming out. And so for the historians among us, with the bread and butter of our work being in the archives, there's an abundance of new records. But there's also the advantage that the Reagan years are recent enough that if you want to supplement your research with interviews, as I did, there are plenty of wonderful folks who served in the Reagan administration who are still available and very helpful to talk. One of them, of course, is one of our discussants today, Ambassador Dobrensky, and I benefited from quite a few interviews too in supplementing the archival research. Want to talk a little bit also about how and why I constructed the book the way that I did. I wrote it as a narrative. This was my first time writing narrative history. I found it to be the most enjoyable type of historical writing I've ever done, and also, frankly, the most difficult. I did that in part because I wanted the book to have, I hope, some crossover appeal and be accessible to general readers as well as to academic specialists. But also embedded within that decision to make it a narrative is an argument and some interpretive themes, and I'm trying to make something of a plea for the role of contingency and agency and individual leadership in history. Of course, we know now that many structural factors and the tectonic plates of geopolitics and certainly developments within the Soviet Union played very important roles in the peaceful end of the Cold War. And with the passing of time, we can learn much more about that. But I wanted to remind myself, to remind readers, that at the time, during the 1980s, in the Reagan administration, no one really knew how the story was going to end. Reagan and a number of his teams certainly had some confidence or hopes that their particular strategy would work out with a happy resolution. But they lived every day in the constant dread and terror of one misstep, leading to global destruction, to nuclear war, to further erosion in America's national security posture. And so in writing as a narrative, I want the reader to, as much as possible, using the historian's craft, to see history as it was unfolding to the people living it and experiencing it at the time, and to show how many of their decisions they were making were with some murkiness, not really knowing where all this was going to go. Reagan himself had a certain confidence that he was steering the country in the Cold War in the right direction, but he could not have been fully sure. And so there's an effort to recapture that. Another aspect of why I wrote it as a narrative, and this is where I will draw a little bit on my previous career before being a scholar of being an erstwhile policymaker, is to recapture the complexities of the policy process itself. And this is both the interpersonal nature of it, the feuds, the rifts among Reagan's team. This is a infamously fractious administration, and many strong-willed, very capable personalities who, even though they were all supporting Reagan and loyal to Reagan, were often at odds with each other. And that's a very important part of the story, but also the many other issues they were dealing with. As you know from my subtitle and book summary, the Cold War is the central theme. It was Reagan's main foreign policy concern, but it's not the only one. And even as he and his team were working on their Cold War strategy, were trying to devise and implement their combination of pressure and outreach to the Soviet Union, they were navigating many other issues crashing into their inbox. International trade, major economic tensions with Japan, trying to reorient our strategic posture in Asia. I'll come back to that in a little bit. Multiple crises in the Middle East, from the Lebanon Civil War to the Iran-Iraq War, of course, hostage crises, terrorism, challenges in Southern Africa, Central and Southern America. These are all within that paradigm of the Cold War, but many of them were somewhat discrete issues on their own. And in writing the book as a narrative, I'm trying to show the interplay of different policies. Just one example, which I go into more detail in the book. The same weekend in October of 1983 that Reagan decided to invade Grenada is also the same weekend that the Hezbollah terrorists blew up the Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 Marines and a number of French peacekeepers as well. And that was just a few weeks after the Korean Airlines Flight 007 shoot down, and a couple of weeks before the complicated but still very fraught Able Archer exercise. And so and in the midst of the INF deployment in Europe as well, right? So a lot is going on just that one weekend, let alone that 1 month. And so I try in the book to show the interplay of those different issues, how Reagan and his team were trying to navigate all those simultaneously, some better than others. So I warn the readers in the introduction, you may feel like you're getting a little bit of whiplash reading this book as it jumps from issue to issue. That is somewhat by design, because I'm trying to recapture some of the feel of what it was like to be a policymaker at that time. Now, turning to some of the main arguments and themes of the book, most of these will focus, again, as I said, on our main concern today of the Cold War. A few of the debates on Reagan policy and the end of the Cold War I jump into. First, I argue in the book against the notion of a Reagan reversal. Rather, I argue that throughout his presidency, there was a pretty consistent policy of the dual strands of pressure and outreach. pressure on the Soviet Union, and we can, during the discussion, talk through some more detail on what the specific strands of that pressure look like, but outreach as well, in hopes for a diplomatic and negotiating partner. Now, sometimes within those two strands, there is going to be a recalibration. Of course, sometimes you might be emphasizing more one than the other, and of course, that may have been the American approach, but the Soviet Union had a vote too. And when, during his first term, when Soviet leaders were, less enthused about negotiations, and, Reagan had some of his conditions there too, it wasn't happening as much. But then, of course, in March of '85, when Gorbachev comes to power and Reagan now has what appears to potentially be and would turn out to be a negotiating partner, a little more emphasis on the diplomacy and outreach strand. But just to give you other examples of how I think both strands are there throughout. In March of '81, right after he's only been in office 2 months, there's the assassination attempt by John Hinckley Jr. And a couple weeks later, as Reagan is recovering from a very literal near-death experience, he handwrites a long, quite conciliatory letter to Brezhnev, to Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, talking about, hey, I would love to sit down and talk. The two of us together really are responsible for the fate of the world. Surely we can find a better way out of this. And every successive Soviet leader he would handwrite letters to with his appeals for negotiating. And we see this in his diaries, his private correspondence, constantly musing, I wonder what those Soviet leaders are thinking. I wish I could just sit down with one of them across the table and talk through our differences. Excuse me. And so those are more examples in the book, but I just want to emphasize that the supposedly hardline, bellicose, belligerent, warmongering Reagan of something of the historical caricature in the first term, those are not false, but rather incomplete, because the outreach gestures were there as well. But then let's, again, look into the second term. Once his negotiating partner, the essential Mikhail Gorbachev, comes on the scene, and you have those series of very consequential summits, Geneva, Reykjavik, Washington, Moscow. Reagan is continuing the pressure. He's continuing the human rights pressure, even as late as May of 1988, when he visits Moscow for that, wonderful and largely harmonious summit. He hosts 100 Soviet dissidents at Spaso House. He's still giving Gorbachev lists of prisoners of conscience he wants released. He is still pressing for more political and religious freedom within the Soviet Union, or even a little bit earlier. Shortly before he's meeting with Gorbachev in Geneva. Again, starting the diplomatic partnership. He signs NSDD 166, dramatically increasing American aid to the Mujahideen, not just in numbers, but in qualitative weaponry as well. A few months later, you're starting to get the Stingers delivered. And again, this is very gruesome. It's brutal. It is sending, hundreds of Soviet soldiers, home in body bags. And so with one hand, he's reaching out to Gorbachev. With the other hand, he is quite literally signing the death warrants for Soviet soldiers. Just one other example, thinking about some of his, most well-known speeches, the Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall speech that takes place in June of 1987. After they've had two summits, after they've built something of a friendship and a partnership, but he still is rhetorically challenging Gorbachev. He's still trying to highlight what he sees as Soviet imperialism in Central and Eastern Europe. So still keeping up the pressure. And again, how to make sense of these different strands of the pressure and the outreach, which I don't think amounts to a full-on reversal in the second term. The interpretive framing I come up with that is he was seeking a negotiated surrender of the Soviet Union. I think there's pretty abundant evidence that to the final end, he did want to see the end of Soviet communism, the end of Soviet imperialism, but he wanted to keep the Cold War cold. He wanted a peaceful outcome. And that's why he wanted to see a Soviet collapse as a negotiated outcome rather than turning into a hot war. A couple other things to highlight before I turn to my betters, Paula and Mel. Thus far, I've focused primarily on Reagan's Soviet strategy, the pressure and outreach. But because Reagan saw the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas, he did not just want to delegitimize the idea of Soviet communism. He also wanted to promote the more positive alternative of market democracies, of the free world. And this is where I do think there was something of a Reagan reversal, right? So I said earlier, I don't think there was a Reagan reversal on his Soviet policy, but it's pretty clear that he came into office, partly an overreaction to Carter administration policies. He comes into office wanting to provide more unconditional support to right-wing military governments who are American allies because they're anti-communist, even if they were thug regimes that were oppressing their people. But I think over the first year and a half in office, and I even identify it kind of from October of 1981 until summer of 1982, he does change so that by summer of 1982, the two pivotal final culminations of this being his Westminster address and then firing Al Haig and picking George Shultz as Secretary of State, I do think he reverses himself to a somewhat more consistent support for democracy and human rights, not just behind the Iron Curtain, but also to start pressuring right-wing authoritarian regimes there. Now, that is not always implemented with perfect consistency. And of course, different policies, different countries may need different tools being used. But there seems to be a realization or a change of mind on his part that for both prudential and principled reasons, the United States needs to show more consistency of helping to support the expansion of market democracies to build, a positive alternative of the free world. One key moment, of course, is when the junta in Argentina invades the Falklands earlier in 1982. Reagan had previously supported them, and he comes to see that these, more brittle, fragile military regimes not only are oppressing their own people, but they sometimes get into foolish wars with other important allies, and just realizes that they're not such reliable allies. El Salvador's elections in the spring are also a turning point for him. We can talk in the Q&A about some of the indicators I see here. And so this, by the second term, becomes, I think, an interesting and somewhat less studied and appreciated aspect of the Reagan legacy is these efforts to support the growth of market democracies. Then finally, just a few comments on his Asia policy, which follows from everything else I've discussed here. Previous American presidents, of course, had seen Asia as a principal theater in the Cold War, even if, Europe may have been the epicenter, obviously going back to the Korean War and then Vietnam, every American president had known that Asia is one of the fronts in the Cold War. But it seems like really starting with Nixon and then Ford and Carter, Asia had been elevated to a strategic front in the Cold War rather than just a peripheral one, especially with Nixon's opening to China and, policies that Ford and Carter had continued. Reagan comes into office agreeing with his predecessors on the strategic importance of Asia, wanting to see Asia as another strategic front in the Cold War, seeing it as a key place to be putting pressure on the Soviets in their Far East. But he flips the equation where he no longer is pursuing a China-first policy, American policy in the Cold War in Asia, but he wants it to be a Japan-first policy. And the challenge he inherits there, of course, is Japan is in the late 1970s, and when he comes in office, primarily seen by most Americans as an economic rival and competitor, stealing our manufacturing jobs, flooding our market with, lower cost consumer goods, but not really a strategic partner. Sure, we had the formal treaty alliance with them, but they were just not seen as a major strategic or military partner. And it seems pretty clear to me, and I try to make this case in my book, that Reagan wants to change that. He wants to transform the U.S.-Japan relationship into primarily a strategic partnership and then just manage the economic rivalry. And in turn, that is part of a broader reorientation of America's posture in the Asia-Pacific, where Japan is now going to be the cornerstone of our posture there, our main partner in countering the Soviet Union. Reagan then has to do his own recalibration on the China-Taiwan front. And again, we can talk about some of that in the Q&A. He does not completely jettison cooperation with China, but he first has to bolster or recalibrate our arms sales to Taiwan, our partnership with Taiwan. And then once he had solidified Japan as the strategic cornerstone, given Taiwan the reassurances they need, then he was actually able to build a pretty pretty constructive partnership with China on somewhat reduced expectations, somewhat more realistic terms, but where they certainly play a key role in our covert support for the Mujahideen, obviously strong intelligence cooperation vis-a-vis the Soviets, and the beginnings of the growing U.S.-China trade relationship. So I think the Asia policy and some of the transformations there are an important and somewhat understudied and underappreciated aspect of the Reagan legacy overall. All right, with that, I will dispense and be eager very much to hear from Professor Leffler and Ambassador Dr. Dobriansky.
William, thank you so much. Our first discussant this afternoon is Ambassador Paula J. Dobriansky, a foreign policy expert and former diplomat specializing in national security affairs. She's a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy Project at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and vice chair of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She brings over 30 years of government and international experience across senior levels of diplomacy, business, and defense. Ambassador Dobriansky has held many Senate-confirmed senior-level positions in the U.S. government, including positions as Director of European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council, Deputy Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, Associate Director for Policy and Programs at the U.S. Information Agency. I could go on and on and on. And indeed, to do justice to her many accomplishments would take me a very long time. Suffice it to say, I've just scratched the surface of her many accomplishments. Ambassador, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Eric, thank you so much. And I'm glad you stopped there. So thank you. Thank you very much. So first, Will, your book, Will Inboden's book is just truly exceptional, and I want to congratulate you on it. I found it to be a most accurate account of the Reagan administration and also a very detailed portrayal of President Reagan. And if I may, I'm going to add one biographic detail to put myself in context. And that is, I was a younger member of the Reagan National Security Council. I started at age 24. I served at the very outset of the Reagan administration when Richard Allen was the national security advisor. And then I left the NSC some 7 years later into midway when Frank Carlucci was the national security advisor. So I was there during a good period of time that really covers a substantial component and range of your book. But I wanted to say that because you use the term narrative history. I loved it. I really loved it. And the reason why I loved it, at least for me as a practitioner, someone who was working there, you made me relive many of the experiences. And then there were some things in your book that I wasn't aware of and that actually I felt was extremely worth spotlighting. Let me go to your title, if I can. I like the title of the book. I didn't want to overlook that. It's worth hearing a little bit more from you about that title because I think it was deliberative. You've already indicated that as choosing the Peacemaker, I mean, the significant element of President Reagan was the fact that Reagan was the one who brought a peaceful end to the Cold War. The way this narrative history is written, there are so many elements to it. I did like also the very fact, and I wanted to comment on it because you said it, by having a narrative history, you do delve into the complexity of the personalities. And I could say this, I'm chuckling a little, by being there on the scene. Yes, the personalities mattered, and the personalities also impacted certainly policy. I can think of so many different examples. I mean, just one example when over speeches, the most contentious speech was the speech of tear down this wall, and where there were those within the National Security Council, some who supported it, some who didn't support it, some at the State Department who were vehemently opposed to it. So elements like that, but showing where Reagan came forward, and he was the one who in the end made that decision. No, I am going to deliver that speech, and I am going to say those words, which were very, very consequential to say the least. I want to highlight the fact of not just your title, but the fact that there was an element of policy that also undergirds the title, and that is peace through strength. When one speaks of President Reagan, one thinks of peace through strength. He focused right from the outset of the administration on rebuilding the U.S. military, and not just only rebuilding, but also looking at the morale of the military and how this element had to undergird our policy. We would not have leverage or peace if we were not strong, and that we were able to engage in a myriad of negotiations from a position of strength. He came in with that strong conviction, and I think that you certainly do capture that throughout the book. Let me mention a few surprises, and that were good, I'm going to say, reminders. I was glad to read your point about how actually the first National Security Council meeting was on the Western Hemisphere, and Reagan cared deeply definitely about the Western Hemisphere. The first NSC meeting was on Central America. And also it was very significant, the first White House visit was from the Jamaican president, Edward Seaga. And in this regard, to me, what was also very striking and an element that was brought out very clearly by and through your book was about Reagan's conviction. And this goes to your theme. And let me just indicate where I come down on the theme. Was he different at the beginning, and then, did he, in terms of his overall approach, did he have, he wasn't consistent. In my book, he was definitely consistent. I don't think he wavered on the issue of his view of Soviet communism, which he was against. His strong belief that freedom was for all and that liberty should be pervasive. And here in this case, how it relates to Seaga was that Seaga was not coincidental. You put it right at the very beginning, how also it was significant that he actually was anti-Cuba and anti-Soviet Union, in contrast to his predecessor. So that's why I just singled that out. Let me also mention a few others. Your words actually, Will, were, quote, unvarnished condemnation of Soviet communism. I have to say that those words to me, since I worked in the unit that was the East-West European division, and I worked with Richard Pipes. It was Richard Pipes and then myself initially. Pipes did the Soviet Union, I did Central Eastern Europe. Then when Pipes left, it was Jack Matlock and then John Lemchowski who came in, and myself during those years that I was there. But I do want to say that in looking back, I think it was significant in terms of the role that Reagan played with regard to an end to the Cold War. You do highlight, which I liked very much in the book, about the national security study directives, and then which were signed into national security decision directives. I would highlight that for any historian because they were significant. Pipes was on the lead with regard to NSDD, the National Security Decision Directive 75 on the Soviet Union. To me, when I look back at it, I mean, it was a seminal piece of work, and it provided that framework of consistency from the beginning to the end. I was more engaged. I was a backbench on 75, but I was engaged on 54, which was on Central Eastern Europe, which also was key in terms of the overall approach and how we looked at the totality of the region. It wasn't just only about the Soviet Union, but it also was how we engage and, if I could use the word, essentially not just differentiate, but fragment those who were taking other approaches. And then, of course, you cite NSDD 32, which was key. A few other comments, and then I'm going to conclude with the last point about battle of ideas. Just a few other observations or comments. One part that I think was important, and I'd like you to comment more on, and that is about speeches and speech writing. You do highlight the Evil Empire speech and the role of Tony Dolan, but the part to me that was very significant was Reagan's role. Reagan actually, more than any other president I know or have known or read about, actually invited in the speechwriters regularly. And actually, they were, if I could even put it in a humorous way, they were a bit in competition with actually the NSC, because it was a battle of words and words mattered. And there were clashes here. But Reagan invited them in. They would sit down, they would banter, about different elements of the speech. But Reagan was the one who decided in the end. He was hands-on in terms of every single speech, and would mark it up, change this, that. So that component, if you'd say some words from your vantage point, because I think that element also led to consistency of approach from the beginning to the end. That, as you said, that he was someone who was strongly and fiercely, anti-Soviet communist, but he also was looking at engagement and ways of engaging and advancing the agenda, but true to his own beliefs, which I totally subscribe to that. And that also, to me, was substantiated by his heavy involvement in his speeches. I wanted to just also mention in this regard the Strategic Defense Initiative, because that was one where there was great controversy. And it was interesting to me, Reagan held his own on the Strategic Defense Initiative, despite a lot of, as you said, the complex personalities in giving their positions. But this was an example where he believed, and you state it in your book, he believed that this was going to really impact Moscow, and it did. And what I also liked about that you said, it not only impacted, but what he was surprised about, that they were spooked. And actually, we also know even after the fact from looking at, I could say, from looking at documents released and from Moscow, and statements made about that period, actually, it really underscores that. So let me conclude by the last part. The last part that you mentioned is, you said where there might be some inconsistency on this battle of ideas, and where at the beginning that maybe he was not, maybe to use the word as really backing the promotion of democracy or freedom, that maybe he was aligning more with more rightist, right of center governments. The challenge that I have for you on that is, and I would challenge it, I didn't see it the same way. And the reason why is because Reagan really embraced Jeane Kirkpatrick's thesis of dictatorships and double standards. And he did that for the reason of advancing democracy and human rights. Her thesis at the time, some agreed to it, some disagreed, but the thesis was, in a nutshell, was that basically authoritarian and totalitarian regimes were not alike. And her view was that, especially in Latin America, there were some military-based governments, like in Chile, and that instead of trying to engage them and not marginalize them and ban them, pull them in, and by pulling them in, you could have a greater impact and actually maybe bring about some change there in promoting human rights and freedom. And that's what I think was what Reagan really embraced and felt was worth as a policy stance supporting. And as you know, he brought her in as his ambassador to the United Nations and elevated at a top level. I'm going to stop there. Eric, back to you, and just thank you for having the chance to give my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Will, would you like to respond to anything that you just heard?
Sure, I will. I'll make a few thoughts. Thank you so much, Paula. It's always with some trepidation that I wait your response, since you lived through all this, and not just lived through it, but you were there, front row seat, making a lot of these policies. And so I appreciate overall your felicitations and words of appreciation. I'll try to be somewhat brief with these, Eric, especially because I'm very eager to hear from Professor Loeffler. So just a few. So first on the title, the Peacemaker, and a number of people have asked me, Inboden, are you trolling us, right? Are you trying to be provocative here? We know that he was a warmonger. No, the title is not meant unironically. And for those who do take the time to read the book, you'll see that term, the peacemaker, occurs throughout it. Reagan, a number of times early in his administration, will refer in his diary or private correspondence to his desire to be a peacemaker. Again, somewhat contrary to the public image, and one can have different assessments about his policies, but that's at least there. But where it really comes out is when Gorbachev first comes to power and is starting to consider doing an initial summit meeting with Reagan. One of Gorbachev's aides, it's in the book, the name is not coming to me right now, writes a memo to Gorbachev saying, this American president, this Reagan guy, he really wants to transform the international system. He wants to regain the initiative, and he really wants to be a peacemaker. Let's see if this is real or not. Then finally, in the epilogue of the book, there's what I regard as a moving scene. Again, readers can make their own judgments, where it's June of 2004, Reagan is lying in state, his casket in the Capitol Rotunda, as he has just died. And Gorbachev makes a surprise visit there and goes and approaches the casket and, rubs it and says, he was a great leader who decided at the right time to be a peacemaker. So the title of the book in that sense really does come from Gorbachev and the tribute that he paid to Reagan. One final place it also comes from, just like I said, it became this recurrent theme, is Reagan's last foreign policy address in public life came in December of 1992 at the Oxford Union. So he's been out of office a few years at this point. It's not soon afterwards that he'll be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And it's called Democracy's Last Battle. And it's a very interesting speech. I encourage everyone to read it. It's actually more mournful and reflective than triumphalist. So he's surveying the peaceful end of the Cold War, but also he is worried about resurgent isolationism he's seen within the United States. He's worried about, the ethnic conflict in the Balkans. And what he worries might be, coming decades of more strife and conflict. And his closing words in the speech, again, cautioning against isolationism, cautioning against an abandonment of American international engagement, are the work of the peacemaker is never done. So that's another place where I got the title. On his speeches, yes, they play, as they play an important role in the book, because I think they played a very important role in his presidency. He devoted tremendous time to them. He had a very capable and gifted team of speechwriters: Tony Dolan, Peggy Noonan, Peter Robinson. But all of them will tell you, and the archives bear this out abundantly, that on the most important speeches, Reagan was very personally involved. A couple scholars did a deep analysis of his Westminster address, and they say that he personally wrote at least 50% of the text himself. And some of this comes from his, previous career in Hollywood, right? He takes communication very seriously. He sees his role as persuading the American people to support his policies, which were admittedly, provocative and controversial. He sees his role as persuading the allies to support and understand his policies. He sees his role as reaching out to the peoples behind the Iron Curtains, as much as our information operations could get his word there as well. And so he's got multiple audiences in mind, and so he takes these speeches very seriously. And we can see some of the more hard-nosed ones as his sustained argument against Soviet communism, Notre Dame in 81, Westminster in 82, Evil Empire, on up through Tear Down This Wall. But he also is, very personally involved in some of the more conciliatory speeches. He writes quite a bit of March 83 SDI speech, including a very clear call: I want to abolish nuclear weapons. I want to, focus our policy on saving lives instead of ending them. January of '84, the Ivan and Anya speech, right? Somewhat mawkish, but still creative effort to reach out directly to the Soviet people and forge people-to-people connections in addition to his outreach to the Soviet leadership. So, yeah, his speeches are essential to understanding the presidency. As it said, and two other things on SDI and then dictatorships and double standards. SDI, again, I'm glad you highlighted, plays a very important role in the book. I'm, of course, mindful of ongoing debates about would it have ever been feasible or not in a technical sense, but the important factor for us, and this really comes out from reading the Reagan-Gorbachev transcripts, the transcripts of their summit meetings, is Gorbachev seemed to really believe SDI would work, or he at least was very spooked by it. He was very obsessed with it. And Reagan realized that, and Reagan did not intend it only as a bargaining chip, but it certainly gave him tremendous leverage. Here, a quick other theme I want to mention, and for any aspiring graduate students on the call, there's multiple dissertations to be written just on the Reagan defense buildup and modernization. A lot more work needs to be done on that. I think we should consider SDI as the culmination of the Reagan defense buildup and modernization, which is not just about throwing more money at the Pentagon, not just about competing with the Soviets, dollar for ruble, tank for tank, missile for missile, and this is where he inherits a framework from the Office of Net Assessment, from the Carter administration, from the Ford administration, this competitive strategies framework of using American technological innovation and advantages to not just outbuild and outspend, but outsmart the Soviets, and designing a next generation of weapon systems that would give such a qualitative edge to the United States that we didn't need to worry about the quantitative arms race. And again, in the Q&A, we can talk about the details there, but SDI should also be seen in that context. He knew that the Soviets, outnumbered us almost 2-to-1 when it came to long-range ICBMs with their SS-18s, and he thought, well, let's just try to make those obsolete rather than building, matching them missile for missile. And finally, on my little provocation about his alleged democracy reversal, yes, he certainly had not only embraced Gene Kirkpatrick's dictatorships and double standards argument, he'd even floated an earlier version of it himself 2 years before she wrote that article in 1977, when he says, look, I think, our authoritarian allies are more reliable and also more prone to reform. We just don't have any examples of a communist dictatorship, a totalitarian one reforming. And so he had certainly, that's, partly why he embraced her in that in her article, what she wrote it in 1979. But I will push back a little bit. One other thing that's important here. The 1979 Nicaraguan and Iranian revolutions are profoundly important for understanding the mindset of the Reagan administration. Those are seen as cautionary tales of when a right-wing ally of the United States falls in a revolution. They may have been bad, but what comes after it can be even worse, right? And so that reinforces the Kirkpatrick argument. But two final thoughts. One, I'm not sure how much Kirkpatrick herself embraced the second part of her argument, which is right-wing authoritarians are prone to reform and they need a nudge. I just didn't see much evidence of her giving them the nudges. I mean, it's a small thing, but in the fall of '83, she writes a letter to Reagan's ambassador to Chile, who's a friend of hers, and she's griping about Schultz and Reagan putting too much pressure on Pinochet. And she said, why is Schultz affecting Reagan? We got to back Pinochet. He's been an American ally. I don't care that he's a thug. Okay, yes, I understand her argument there about he's anti-communist, but what about pushing him to reform? And she seems frustrated that Reagan and Schultz are pushing him to reform. She primarily blames Schultz. And so I think that's partly why, for all of her accomplishments, she leaves the administration after the first term and some frustration. She is not on board with Schultz, and then to a lesser but still important extent, Reagan, and frankly, Paul Wolfowitz and Elliot Abrams and others who want to be pushing a democracy agenda with our right-wing allies. So anyway, a real privilege to be able to respond to those great thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second discussant this afternoon is a familiar face at the Wilson Center and a previous participant in the Washington History Seminar. Melvin Leffler is also someone I have learned a great deal from over the years. as have my students. He is Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Virginia, and he's the prize-winning author of books on the Cold War, including A Preponderance of Power, National Security, the Truman Administration, and the Cold War, published in 1992, For the Soul of Mankind, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War, 2008. His new book, Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush, and the Invasion of Iraq, will be published by Oxford University Press in early 2023. And I don't think I'm giving away anything in saying this. It'll be the subject of a seminar in the spring. Mel, welcome back to the Washington History Seminar.
Thanks so much, Eric, for inviting me to participate. I'm really glad to have this opportunity. And it's a pleasure really listening to you, Paula, as well, and hearing your commentary from the inside of the Reagan administration. Will, thank you for writing such an important book. I think it can be said that at this moment, it's the best and most comprehensive account that we have of the Reagan administration's foreign policies. And I like it for many, many reasons. The writing is good. You wanted to write a evocative narrative history, and you really accomplished that. But at the same time, what I like so much is that your themes are stated very clearly. The research is impressive, especially in the Reagan Library materials. And the organization of the book is really effective. Within the single chapters, I would say that you deftly weave events in many disparate parts of the globe. When I wrote my big book on the Truman administration and the early Cold War policies, one of the toughest challenges I faced was actually trying to integrate what Truman and his advisors were doing in different parts of the world. And you really managed to do that, in my opinion, extremely skillfully. Substantively, you mobilize a lot of good evidence to support your fundamental argument. And simply stated, I'll reiterate it. You emphasize that by combining power and outreach, pressure and engagement, passion and empathy, Reagan orchestrated the negotiated surrender of the Soviet Union and of totalitarian communism. As a result, you say very cogently, very succinctly, Reagan won the Cold War. But the book is different than many other triumphalist accounts because you actually acknowledge Reagan's many flaws. You pay attention to his own lack of attention to detail, his inability to impose discipline on his subordinates, his support of right-wing thugs, and his own susceptibility to self-deception. And I think you really show that very well during the Iran-Contra crisis. The book, I want to emphasize, is also different than many other triumphalist accounts because you stress that winning the Cold War required more than military power. It required more than ideological zeal. It required more than economic pressure. You beautifully stress Reagan's negotiating skill, his ability to empathize at times with the adversary, his capacity to learn and evolve, and his sincere hatred and fear of nuclear weapons. You also, in my opinion, make real contributions to the literature by highlighting Reagan's commitments to traditional alliances like NATO, and by illuminating his arduous courtship of Japanese friendship when anti-Japanese sentiment was growing in the USA. You really nicely show that pivot from China to Japan in a very skillful way and a very important way. So there's no doubt, in my opinion, that this book is a major accomplishment. But I have 4 questions for you, Will. The first set of questions deal with causation, and they in part get to the heart of your book. Do you attribute too much agency to Reagan? If Reagan did A and Gorbachev did B, did A necessarily cause B? If Reagan rearmed and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Gorbachev agreed to eliminate his intermediate nuclear forces, does it mean that Gorbachev bowed to Reagan's pressure? Although there are many indications, as you and Paula just said, that the Strategic Defense Initiative mattered, many indications, there are just as many denials by Gorbachev's aides and by Gorbachev himself about the impact of SDI. Did not Gorbachev want to ramp down the arms race because he wanted to reform the Soviet economy and Soviet society? Was he really bowing to external pressure, or was he acting according to his own internal priorities, or perhaps doing both? Likewise, with regard to causation, if Reagan exerted economic pressure, which he did, and the Soviet economy subsequently collapsed, which it did the economic pressure cause the collapse? Or would a close examination of the chronology show that the collapse came after Reagan, and actually not because of outside pressure, but because of Gorbachev's own inept, extremely incompetent handling of domestic economic and financial reforms? So as much as I share your favorable view of Reagan's interactions with Gorbachev, I question whether you are attributing too much influence to Reagan's own agency. My second question has to do with strategic vision. I really admire your treatment of Reagan's most essential strategic insight. The Soviet Union, Reagan believed, had fundamental weaknesses, and the United States could exploit them. But here's my question. Did Reagan possess equal strategic insight into the global international system? Reagan saw the world in bipolar terms. But as you know, there's a vast new historical scholarship suggesting that the Cold War international system already had transitioned by the end of the 1970s. Scholars like Günter Luthi, Paul Chamberlain, Anna Westad, Matt Connolly, they argue that the global South was already in a post-colonial phase where ethno-cultural conflict, where religious sectarianism, where socio-economic strife, and where regional animosities transcended the battle, far transcended the battle between democratic capitalism and command economies. So did Reagan misperceive? And did his misperceptions, as many of these authors have written, worsen local regional conflicts and cause unnecessary travail? Do we historians misconstrue the big picture by accepting Reagan's own vision as accurate? My third question has to do with human rights. I share your admiration and Paula's of Reagan's speeches and his own ability to insert himself into his speeches. I share your admiration for his ability to champion the cause of human freedom rhetorically. And I admire the treatment that shows the steady evolution toward democracy promotion, especially in places like South Korea, the Philippines, and Chile. But do you minimize Reagan's blindness or indifference toward repressive tyrants in Central America and toward the apartheid regime in South Africa? Now, I take note that you do condemn his support of, quote, brutish thugs, end quote, like Rios Montt in Guatemala. But does the word thugs trivialize the reality that hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions, were killed, imprisoned, and displaced by Reagan's authoritarian friends and by US support for them? You justify these policies because you know that they existed. You justify them by saying that otherwise these countries would have fallen to, quote, end quote, Soviet predation. But many scholars studying the civil wars in the global South don't really think that Soviet policy was a significant factor. Here again, are we allowing ourselves to be entrapped by Washington's own, perhaps distorted lens? And here's my last question. It has to do with timing. Do you overstate the case for Reagan winning the Cold War? After all, when he left office, Europe was still divided. The Berlin Wall was still standing. Communist regimes still afloat. Key negotiations regarding strategic and conventional weapons still in limbo. And the Soviet Union still intact. Might supporters of George H.W. Bush question whether you are implicitly downplaying much that went on after Reagan left office? Your book, in other words, raises really big questions. I'm interested in what you have to say about these issues, but I want to finish by emphasizing that we're really all indebted to you for writing a truly terrific synthetic book that will shape the scholarship and our understanding of this era for a very long time. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Mel. Will?
Yeah,
A
no.
response?
Yes, thank you very much, Mel. Of course, I will express unequivocal gratitude for your words of praise, but also I'll say unequivocal gratitude for your penetrating questions there. I mean, it is at the risk of obsequiousness, you have forgotten more about the Cold War than I have yet learned, and I've been studying it for a long time, and you've been studying it for much longer. And so it is, you pay me the great honor of reading my book, of taking these arguments seriously and engaging thoughtfully. And I'm mindful that we'll potentially have some questions from some of our other audience too. So I will try to give thoughtful but succinct answers to Dr. Leffler's four categories here. First, on causation, and I'm looking down at my notes here to make sure I'm reading this accurately. So if everyone wonders why Inboden's looking down, the risks of Zoom. Do I attribute too much agency to Ronald Reagan? This is something I wrestled with, and the important disclaimer is I have not written here an international history of the Cold War. It's not an international history of the global order in the 1980s. It is a focused history on American policymaking in the 1980s in the Reagan administration. And while I try to, where it seemed appropriate, bring in what Gorbachev was saying or what some of his aides were saying or their perspective where I can, there is always, of course, I have to admit the risk of when you're looking for something, you will find it. And, when you're looking only at American policy making, that will emerge as more predominant. And so I just have to acknowledge that risk. And of course, readers can make up their own minds. But on some of the specifics you do ask about on agency, I've tried to play all sorts of different counterfactuals in my mind. I'll just toss a few of them out there. I know that many of the rest of our audience has mulled these as well. What if Reagan had won the Republican primary in '76, had beat Ford, and then somehow had actually beat Carter as well? And I think if Reagan had won the primary, he might have had a better chance of beating Carter in '76. So what if Reagan is sworn into office in January of '77? I think he had the same convictions that he came in with four years later. I don't know that the story would have ended quite the same way. I don't know that the international environment, circumstances, some of these other trends, Pope John Paul come into power a couple years later, in '78, Margaret Thatcher in '79, some of the growing decrepitude of the Soviet Union. I do think that it is fortuitous for Reagan that he comes into office when he does 4 years later, when international conditions are a little more ripe for the new policies that he wants to push as well. Another counterfactual I've tried to run is, let's say Chernenko had lived longer, right, and Gorbachev doesn't come along till a few years later, and Chernenko was the one that Reagan dealt with throughout his second term. Could the Soviet Union have kept on, limping along a little bit more? And again, our mutual friend and my former graduate student Simon Miles has written a great book on the Andropov and Chernenko years. I can't say exactly what it would have been, but no, I don't think things would have ended the same way. Gorbachev is essential and indispensable for the peaceful end of the Cold War. And I say that without qualification. And I would apologize if my book gives an impression otherwise. I also will not back away from the argument in the book that Reagan is also essential and indispensable. And I try to push a little more on Reagan's first term policies of pressuring the Soviet Union to strengthen the reform forces within to produce a reformist leader, which is one reason why I think he recognizes Gorbachev a little earlier than others, including his own government, as a genuine reformer that he can work with. And I'll come back around to a couple of those in answering your final question. Second, the question on strategic vision. Yeah. You and I think are in agreement on Reagan has a real strategic vision with the Soviet Union. I would say less so with the entire international order. Although I'll give Schultz a little more credit here. I think Schultz is even more visionary on the entire international order. I mean, looking at a number of Schultz's second-term speeches on the information age, on the communications revolution, on emerging globalization, and then shifting identities. So I think Schultz is even more of an apostle of the future, maybe than Reagan himself there. I only put out a couple provocations in my concluding chapter, which again, as you know, is overall laudatory of Reagan, but trying to point out unintended consequences, second and third order effects of some of his policies. And look, to put more of a specific point on that, at different times during his administration, he was authorizing the provision of American weapons to Iraq, Iran, the Mujahideen, of course, in Afghanistan, and China, all four of whom in different incarnations within 10, 15 years would be mortal adversaries of others of the United States, right? And so that is certainly a part of the record. To that, I would just fall back on no president can get everything right. There are hard trade-offs to be made. As you know, I try to weave through subtext of a Niebuhrian sense of irony and tragedy and all this of hard choices. So on the human rights one. First, readers can judge for themselves if I'm condemnatory enough of some of the, thug regimes, the brutal regimes. I didn't mean the word thug to downplay any of the, manifest atrocities and murders. It does bear remembering that while Reagan was supporting and authorizing some of our support of those regimes, he had also inherited that from just about every previous American president, from Truman on forward, had in different ways been providing support to those regimes. This is not necessarily to excuse it, but to say that Reagan is rather unexceptional in that respect. South Africa, I think he bears a little more culpability for being, at a minimum, very, very obtuse there. I think it's clear that he abhorred bigotry. He did not like the apartheid regime. He makes it very clear, but he downplayed it as a priority. His vetoing of the 1986 sanctions bill, I think, exemplifies the worst of that there. Then background two, do I overstate the case for Reagan winning the Cold War, especially when, as you point out, when he leaves office on January 20th, 1989, Soviet Union is still intact, the Berlin Wall is still up, and so on and so forth. Well, first, I would use an analogy, which some may find persuasive, others provocative or obnoxious. I will give Reagan credit for his role in winning the Cold War in the same way that we give Franklin Roosevelt credit for the Allies' victory in World War II. When Roosevelt dies, Hitler is still alive and in power. Imperial Japan is still in power, right? But over the next several months, Germany surrenders, Japan surrenders, and the war comes to an end. And so I think we can certainly give Reagan credit for having envisioned a peaceful victory in the Cold War and putting quite a few of the policies in place that certainly contribute to it. My final counterfactual, if he had not been elected president in 1980, if he had never been elected, if there'd been a second Carter term, or maybe even a George H.W. Bush term, and I think very, very highly of George H.W. Bush, no, I don't think the Cold War would have ended in the peaceful and favorable terms the way that it did. It would have ended at some point. We can't know quite how it would have, but I do want to see Reagan as an essential, even if he is not the completely sufficient actor in how it ended.
Thank you very much. We now open this up. We have a number of people with their hands up, and we have a number of folks with questions in the Q&A. So we are going to start with Daniel Scharf. If you would unmute yourself, you can join the conversation and pose the question yourself.
I think you were still on mute.
He is on mute.
Yeah. The vexations of Zoom.
Okay. How about I go next to Stephen Shore?
Here's Mr. Sharp.
Daniel, your hand is you're unmuted.
It is me, but I didn't put my hand up, Eric. I'm sorry. I don't know how that happened. It's a glitch.
So now you unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Shore. I think you know the routine.
A wonderful talk, and my question is, I think that by any yardstick, Ronald Reagan's successes in foreign policy were far greater than he could ever have imagined on taking office in January 1981. I say this as someone who did not vote for him. But my question is, what do you consider to be his greatest failure in foreign policy?
Yeah, I think his two greatest failures are both roughly in the same region, and they're both in the Middle East. I certainly think the Beirut intervention, as tragic as it was, ended up with very, very bad outcomes at great cost to certainly American lives, but did not solve the Lebanese civil war, the Israeli invasion, and of course Iran-Contra too. I'm even more critical of the arms sales to Iran and the failed bid to release the hostages and do the strategic opening there. I try to provide context and explanation for all that without excuses in the book, as Dr. Leffler mentioned. So.
Thank you. Steve Rhodes, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Okay. Will, first off, the fact that you have Ambassador Dobryansky as part of her background, as part of your book, speaks volumes. I worked in the Reagan administration. I was a special assistant to the president for the first 2 years and met Paula then. And she is a credit to what I saw with President Reagan in his willingness to bring in younger people and fresh ideas. And Paula was, in my estimation, one of the Soviet experts in the NSC. Additionally, you talked about the president's success with the eliminating of the Soviet Union. Well, after the midterm elections, I became Vice President George Bush's chief domestic policy advisor. And I was with him on his tour of Northern Europe, where we talked about locating cruise missiles. And I think that also contributed to the success of the president with regard to the Soviet Union. What I saw was the President Reagan, used Vice President Bush as a sounding board for a lot of these international issues. But I can't thank you enough for bringing in Ambassador Dobryansky into your book. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Rhodes. It's always an honor to meet or interact with people who'd worked for President Reagan. I never met him myself personally, and so I hope I tried to recapture the history as accurately as possible for those who lived through it. And of course, I share your esteem for Ambassador Dobryansky. I will say just briefly, again, for our viewers, there's a lot more really important historical work that needs to be done on Vice President Bush. Again, I emphasize that the Bush-Reagan relationship, very, very complicated. I was able to benefit from some recently declassified documents, but there's still a lot more yet to be mined. I do think it's notable how they became a pretty important partnership, considering that they had not been personally close. They'd been political rivals. Reagan picked Bush as his running mate largely as a matter of political convenience to unite the more moderate and conservative wings of the party. And it was a great credit to Bush that he, served so faithfully and loyally during those 8 years. And in turn, you can see in the archives, abundant evidence of Reagan's growing trust and reliance on him. Bush as a key emissary in navigating China-Taiwan in particular. Bush comes back with a very important, interesting report from the Chernenko funeral on his first meeting with Gorbachev, signals to Reagan, this may be the guy we've been waiting for. And back to Dr. Loeffler's earlier comments, I don't want to take anything away from the Bush 41 administration and their masterful diplomacy in navigating that peaceful end of the Cold War too. I just want to make a case that they inherited a very good hand from the Reagan team. So,
Eric, I just want to say thanks. Thank you, Steve. Very kind words. I'm just lucky to have been an interviewee of Will Inboden. But thank you.
Thank you. Max Castro Paredes has a hand up. Please unmute, pose a question.
Hi, good evening. Hey, can you hear me? Oh, hi, good evening. Hey, really, this has been a fantastic tour the horizon of really the Reagan administration. Dr. Inboden, your book, really, I haven't worked myself all the way through, but my question really would have to do with what you just brought up right now about President Bush and Reagan, about their relationship. I'll say, I went to UVA. I was a recent graduate. I was a student of Dr. Loeffler, and I now work as a research assistant to Ambassador Dobryansky. And really, I'm curious and learning more about what most surprised you, I guess, about that relationship. And thank you so much.
Sure. So, yeah. Again, another clue for anyone who'll be diving more into the archives there. I was struck by how little Bush would speak during most of the National Security Council meetings. And that's why the relationship is still somewhat opaque and elusive. But in turn, it's very clear that he reserved his counsel for Reagan for their weekly lunches. Reagan looked forward to those. He felt like he had complete trust and confidence in Bush. And Bush, and I don't mean this at all in a disparaging way, but a very savvy and shrewd bureaucratic operator who knows, hey, I will have the president's undivided attention when it's just the two of us, and I don't have to kind of share my thoughts in front of everyone else, and maybe Weinberger or Schultz or others are going to later want to undercut me there. Also important to understand that Bush from the moment he becomes the running mate, the vice president, is very close to James Baker, arguably his best friend, White House chief of staff in the first term, and then Secretary of Treasury in the second term. And so the Bush-Baker axis, I think, is also pretty important, another avenue of influence for Bush. But in turn, even when Bush may have personally differed with some of what Reagan wanted to do, he really understood that there's only one president at the time. I'm the vice president. It's my job to help carry this out. Again, a good example would be on China, Taiwan. Bush's personal proclivities, I think, were a little more in line with Nixon, Ford, Kissinger of let's prioritize the China relationship here. He didn't want to completely abandon Taiwan, but he is less keen on supporting Taiwan as much as Reagan wanted. But Reagan had been very clear. We need to continue our arms sales to Taiwan. We can't throw them under the bus. And Bush carries that out very faithfully and flying over for multiple rounds of negotiations with Deng Xiaoping.
Thank you. We have an anonymous attendee who asks a question. If you could talk about Nicaragua's Contra War and Reagan's support and the reasons for that support. And I would like to tag on my own question, so moderator's prerogative, I guess. And what struck me in reading this and remembering the 1980s and remembering Reagan's Central America policies, his depiction of the Contras as the moral equivalent of the founding fathers and, these heroic freedom fighters were just patently false. And there was an sense of an exaggeration about the imminent threat that the Nicaraguans posed. And in the book, you do a very good job of kind of providing kind of a multifaceted analysis of the various parties that the Reagan administration is dealing with that would allow a critic of the policy to say, yes, absolutely, this is our point. When you talk about the bloodletting in Guatemala, when you talk about the terror in El Salvador, these are kind of moving and powerful sections. And yet, at the end of the day, you basically, I think, exonerate Reagan to a degree by saying, such were the difficult choices of the Cold War. On the one hand, it's terrible. On the other hand, it's terrible. But it's not clear that those two terrible things are necessarily equal. So if you could talk about the Contra War and the Central America policy, perhaps a bit more.
Sure. I'll say what I can. There's a lot there. I'll try not. Do we have 5 more hours we can go? Right. So yeah, I know there's a lot. Yeah. So I obviously can't go into exhaustive detail, but just a few things for context. One, it's very clear when Reagan comes into office that he really wants to prioritize hemispheric relations. It comes out very much in the archives, in the internal documents, that he is, I think, much more self-aware about America's troubled history of intervention in the region. He refers to this often. He says, we're often seen as the Colossus of the North. We don't want to be that. We want to support self-empowerment, self-determination for these different countries. This does not, that won't persuade all of his critics. It doesn't necessarily justify all the policies, but that's very different than, let's say, hypothetically, the archives would have said, all right, well, all those countries south of the border, they need to acknowledge that they're just pawns of the United States. And they're de facto colonies. And, as long as we keep them out of communism, I don't care what is done. We never see that, right? That there's much more mindfulness there. But there is also a very genuine and sincere concern about further communist inroads and those countries fall into communism. And again, the 1979, like I said, Nicaraguan revolution had been a real shock to the system for him. We can obviously debate almost endlessly how genuine and real was that threat of communism, how much of it is supported by Moscow, how much is supported by Havana, as opposed to how much of this is more indigenous nationalist movements, agrarian reform, self-determination. The truth is, I think it's a mixture of all of those. How we weight those will shape quite a bit what our final prescriptions are. Because again, yes, we can talk about the bloodshed of right-wing dictatorships, which is absolutely ghastly. And again, I make very clear that I'm on the side of supporting democracy and human rights with as much consistency as possible. But we cannot talk about Any Cold War policies without talking about the body count and death toll of communist regimes too. And again, I laid that out at the beginning, but right, anywhere from 65 to 100 million people, of the vast majority civilians, killed by communist regimes in the 20th century. So that is the important context. On the particulars of the Nicaragua program. When Reagan comes in, his first priority really is El Salvador, and he is very concerned about the Sandinistas supporting the FMLN in El Salvador. I'm going to mention this because he very quickly turns to wanting to support the Contras in Nicaragua, but he gets to Nicaragua conceptually through El Salvador. That's just the important point there. And of course, he inherits that El Salvador policy from the Carter administration, who also had some really tough calls, but had decided in Carter's last couple of weeks in office, we need to support the Salvadoran government. But then he inherits a really bad hand with El Salvador, right? It is this weak and fragile government, which is this perverse combination of the death squads and Dobasan and Arena, and then the more moderate Christian Democrats who are also pretty weak, and then what I think is a genuine communist insurgency with the FMLN. And Reagan also is aware of this. So there's one of his diary entries I mentioned where after he meets with Duarte, he says, we are trying to support the Christian Democrats against the extremists of the right and the left. And it's not just rhetorical support. It is, hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. It's CIA covert action against the right-wing death squads, right? So there is a concerted effort to beat back, to undercut, to defang, dethrone the right-wing death squads. I think, it's clear that Reagan was perhaps over-optimistic and somewhat naive about the Contras, but there wasn't a whole lot that really could be known about them, I think, at the time, at least when he initially takes office. And well, look at the Ortega regime in Nicaragua even today. I think over time we've seen that they were not the agrarian reformers that some of their supporters on the American left had also hoped. So I will fall back on there were difficult choices there, and this applied across the board, right? We were also supporting the communist regime in China in the 1980s. FDR supported Stalin in the 1940s, right? I mean, this is, these are the hard choices of geopolitics. For me, a lot of it comes down to regarding the threat, the moral iniquities of communism as more severe, that do not fully justify, but at least help us understand some of these lesser of two evils choices.
Thank you. Andreas Etkes has a hand up. Please unmute. Please unmute.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this discussion. And I haven't had a chance to read your book yet. I am from Germany. And thank you also, Mel Leffler, for your questions, because I also would like to ask something along these lines. While also in my own research, I've become more appreciative of that Reagan clearly played a huge role in ending the Cold War. I also have some problems with the title of your book, because the emphasis is on Reagan, the peacemaker, and then the Cold War and the world on the brink. Well, why, again, I haven't read your book, why is the world on the brink? And didn't Reagan play partly a role in this? And several, you and others have emphasized how Reagan, the big role he also played in the speech writing. Well, Reagan's first press conference, in the first press conference, he calls the Soviet leaders criminals, liars. He criticizes detente, and his rhetoric and some of the speeches were mentioned. This is kind of what the Soviet Union saw and what the international public heard from Reagan. So isn't this a very contradictory approach? Where is the peacemaker in that, if he keeps criticizing the Soviet Union in such a strong way? So again, I appreciate the research, and I've moved a little bit in this direction, but I also think you're going a little too far in the just Reagan, the praising him with the very large picture and the victory in the Cold War. And one remark on Nicaragua, maybe just like with Cuba, who knows how things had turned out? And I'm very critical of Ortega too, how things would have turned out without the US for years or sometimes decades, not letting these countries develop in the way they might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. All right, a lot there. I'll just cover. So Reagan saw the Soviet communism as one of the greatest threats to world peace. And again, it's no accident. I generally share that assessment too. So I try to, and again, I hope you will take the time to read the book. You might find it persuasive. You might not. But he was very deliberate with that strong rhetoric. He believed it. He thought that Soviet, communism was evil, and that part of his strategy was to bring that rhetorical pressure and to delegitimize it. But as I tried to describe in the book, he was doing that also while he was terrified of nuclear weapons. Mel rightly highlights this. He wanted to keep the Cold War cold. He did not want the entire globe going up in nuclear destruction. And so it's a very difficult balance he was trying to do of that pressure, that condemnation, and also that outreach. And I know you're speaking there from Germany. It certainly was very controversial at the time. Look at the 200,000 or 300,000 protesters who greeted him on his first visit to Germany in 1982 as president, and it was not a warm welcome. But I want to make the case that I think we can. I'm going to make the case that eventually those policies did work, and that a lot of the victims of Soviet communism, a lot of people living behind the Iron Curtain, certainly within the Soviet Union, appreciated him giving voice to some of their own qualms and speaking on behalf of the oppression that they were feeling.
Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A from Thomas Simons, who asks, I and George Shultz have believed that the negotiations to free the Pentecostals in our Moscow embassy was a turning point, Reagan's first successful negotiation. So was he ready for more by mid-1983? Wrong?
Right. No, thank you, Tom. Great question. Amen. I guess I can say that if we're asking about Siberian Pentecostals. I know we're running out of time. I won't go into the full episode there. My book does give a pretty extensive treatment of it because it is so important. And one of the importance I want to highlight for it is trust building. Reagan, the old Hollywood labor negotiator, knew that oftentimes with negotiations, you got to start small, and then if you can build trust and build it up. And so Reagan, working with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, you lived through this and we're working on it, but for others here, cuts a quiet deal. Paula was working on this too, with the Kremlin, that if you let those Siberian Pentecostals have safe exit from the embassy and so they can get asylum in the United States, we will keep quiet about it. We will not publicly humiliate you. We will not crow about it. We will see that you have been worthy of our trust, and we want to be worthy of your trust. And it takes a few more months, but as you know, that's exactly how it worked out. And for Reagan, that was a real turning point of seeing, yes, as much as I'm going to keep up the pressure, I do think that there's a basis for establishing trust and working on much bigger negotiations with the Soviets.
And if I just could say greetings, Tom Simon, glad that you put your oar in the water in this because you played such a key role and certainly in the release of those Pentecostals, among other areas that you dealt with within the Soviet Union and no less Poland. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a question in the Q&A from Spencer Michaels, a retired PBS NewsHour correspondent. And I think your book has an answer to this question. Reagan, he says, was not an intellectual or even very well versed in foreign policy or academia. He mocked pointed-headed professors when he was California governor. How did his lack of study and experience in international affairs and his hostility to academia affect his performance in dealing with the communists?
Yeah, so I will agree with you that Reagan was not an intellectual. He would have said so himself. But I do try to make a case, and if you have a chance to read the book, you can tell me if it's persuasive or not, that he is more of a man of ideas, that he takes ideas seriously, that he ran a campaign based on ideas, that he saw the Cold War and even America's overall geopolitical challenges as a contest of ideas. Just a couple of vignettes to highlight this. One, I was really struck as he was putting together his foreign policy advisory team, his campaign in 1980. Of the first 60 or so advisors who are announced, something like exact numbers in my book, something like 48 of them have PhDs, and quite a few are, tenured professors from Harvard, Stanford, Georgetown. And so intellectuals, conservative intellectuals, yes, but intellectuals were drawn to him because they saw him, not just because they liked some of his policies, but they saw him as a candidate of ideas. Second is, it's now pretty clear from the archives, from his diaries, from a number of other declassified documents that on the issues that mattered to him, especially U.S.-Soviet relations, but also quite a bit with U.S. Asia policy, he would get more involved in the details. He'd meet with scholars. He'd read his briefing memos pretty carefully. He had a photographic memory. And did take scholarly learning more seriously. He himself was not of that camp. Other issues he'd be less attentive to details on. Of course, he got quite a bit of criticism from the scholarly community, which then is now leans much more left. Not a lot of professors voted for him, I think. But I have at least a somewhat revisionist take on him in the book. I hope you can read it, and I'd love to hear if you find it even moderately persuasive.
I would just like to add to that one of the interesting things is that when Jack Matlock replaces Richard Pipes, Matlock prepares for the president a series of extensive memos on Russian history, culture, religion, that Reagan reads very carefully and thoughtfully. And I think one of the things you show in your book, and others have written about as well, is that Reagan does learn and evolve and begin to understand some of the factors shaping the perceptions and sensibilities of Soviet leaders. So in a sense, he's prepared for Gorbachev. He's ready for Gorbachev.
Thanks. Yeah, Soviet Union 101 is what he and Matlock call it. Very extensive brief materials, absolutely. Yeah.
And they brought in Suzanne Massey and Firebird. And so Dr. Leffler's absolutely right, and so are you, Will.
I unfortunately have to draw the seminar to a close. I think we could indeed go on for many hours more. But I do want to thank William, Mel, and Paula for this terrific exchange, and thanks to those in the audience with questions, and apologies to those whose questions we couldn't get to. But I do want to invite you all back to the seminar this coming Monday, December 12th, when we return to explore a new book by Yale historian Beverly Gage entitled G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, with discussants John Fox and Ellen Schrecker. Till then, thanks very much, take care, and good night, everyone.